coming in.
So that's their role.
You were talking about
Yeah, secretary. Unspoken for.
They may get, put your hat in the show.
Yeah, your head's in there.
It is, everyone can hear me?
Go closer.
Closer.
That's better.
Everyone can.
Pull your chair.
It is a great pleasure to introduce Maddie Lee. And I had no idea of what an interesting pleasure it would be until I met and spoke with her and said, I know nothing about you, let's have lunch. Well, what a lunch. I will simply say that we will start with Maddie's work here at Woodland Pond and her foundation work in New York City before she came here, which kind of helped infuse her thinking about Woodland Pond. A little bit about her work in Albany, and hopefully we'll have time at the end to talk about her family history, which she said I should describe as two ships. Two ships. I prefer to describe it as from the Mayflower to the Shtetl. You will find out, Maddie.
Okay, I want to start by allowing those of you who came hoping to get rich details on the Council on Community, CCRCs. I want to give you time to leave because that part is non-existent. I will tell you, and you will be disappointed, and then we can go on to other things. Because as soon as I found out what they wanted, I wrote to Tamar and I wrote to Yakov and I said, there is nothing to say about the Council on CCRCs. This is a state council mandated, and any non-profit CCRC that wants to do something that might affect its legal status has to get the approval of this council. I was first contacted 3 years ago. And then I said, certainly I'd be happy to do this, and then I never heard anything else for a year. And I figured, okay, I don't know, they found out about my checkered past, I don't know what. Then I got a frantic phone call saying, the governor has nominated you, we need the following information. And it was a stack of papers about this big, and it included getting fingerprinted. It included a visit from a state trooper. Actually, the visit from the state trooper came after the interview by the state trooper, and he said there were a few things that had been left off. Like, what did you major in college? And I said, I don't remember, which didn't help. So I was nominated. I got a nice, gorgeous gilt thing from Governor Cuomo, whom I'd never met, and then nothing happened. Nothing happened for months. Then I got a frantic message to the effect they'd be meeting by Zoom. I have a computer that can hear but cannot speak. And nobody believes me when I say that, so every time I'm on a Zoom call and they can't hear me, I say, forget it, and they keep saying, you see the little microphone in the corner of the screen? And I say, yes, and it doesn't work. So I couldn't say anything at that meeting. Then, about 4 months ago, there was in fact a meeting in Albany, and nothing happened. And if it had, I wouldn't be allowed to tell you because everything we do is confidential. So, aren't you glad you came? Please feel free to leave, I will not be offended. I thought I'd say a little bit about my employment history. That's what one of the things you asked. How did I get to where I am?
Employment history, both the women's movement and the foundation.
And the community organizing work. And the community organizing work.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's my employment history. My first job after being a camp counselor was writing very brief definitions of words beginning with P for the back pages of the Book of Knowledge, no longer available, but some of you may remember it. Then I taught high school English at the Dalton School, and I was part of founding a breakaway alternative, open classroom, mushy, crunchy granola school. Quite hot news in New York at the time. The headmaster of Dalton at the time was William Barr's father, Donald Barr, quite a notorious fellow in his own way. And I ran this little crunchy granola school for about 8 years. The only reason we could survive for 8 years is that the landlord lacked a certificate of occupancy for the space that we were using, so we sued him and we never had to pay any rent. I was drafted to join something called the Women's Action Alliance because of friends that I knew, and I worked on a project called the National Women's Agenda. You can begin to see how long ago this was. It was in the run-up to the UN Year of Women, which I know you all celebrated. And I was a delegate to the national convention of that. Then I was asked to submit a resume to an organization I had never heard of. No, I wasn't asked, I was told that they were pleased that I had submitted my resume, which I had not done. So I got a very nice note, and it was in connection with the New York Foundation. This is not the New York Community Trust, which is vast, huge. The New York Foundation is one of the 2 oldest foundations in the country, and it is small. And I said, oh, okay, I'm pleased that I did. And they were interested enough to interview me. It was a board entirely composed of white men, with the exception of one white woman and one very well-known black man, Kenneth Clark. Those of you who remember sociology, he's the man who invented the experiment about children with black dolls and white dolls. And the interview was held in a room about this big, and my entrance door was there, and they were sitting there at the end of a table that was about this long, and lit with downlights, and nobody was smiling, and they were all at that end of the room, and I was really nervous. And my seat was at the head of this table, and I sat down and I said, I suppose you're wondering why I called you here today. And they thought that was funny. Kenneth Clark asked me whether I ever worried about the morality of a situation in which a very small number of people determine how to spend a great deal of money. And I said, Dr. Clark, why are you on this board if you feel that it's not more moral? And I thought, okay, I either just got the job or I just lost it. And in fact, I got the job and I worked there for 25 years. And it is responsible for most of my political beliefs. I come from a family of Democrats for many generations. But it is where I learned about community organizing. It's where I learned about the effect of a small amount of money, carefully applied if you do it right. And I got to see parts of New York that white people don't go to at the invitation of the people who live there. We funded community-based organizations that were run by the people affected by the problem. We made small grants, but we chose places where it made a tremendous difference. And one of the 2 great conversions in my life, many of you know what the other one was, came at an evening in a basement in Brooklyn where 100 community people were gathered. And it was a meeting of ACORN, which some of you may know about. It stands for the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now. And I had never seen anything like it. I had simply never seen anything like it, and so I was with the zeal of a convert. When I say I've gotten views of New York that nobody else would get, Shamar asked me what a couple of them were, and one of them was a trip up to the Bronx to a 5-block, absolutely blasted, bombed out area, nothing but bricks, nothing standing, in the middle of which was a very small black boy sitting down and looking at something. And I was with a woman who worked for the Bronx Botanical Gardens, and they had done an outreach program to the people in the neighborhood. And this was a program teaching neighborhood kids how to plant flowers. Unfortunately, she said, she could show me their gardens, but the kids were all gone because they'd been gone on a field trip. But this little boy had sat there in the heat, waiting for the lady from the garden to teach him how to water his marigold. That was a killer. I've been to Bed-Stuy by subway. When each stop that I passed, more and more white people got off and more black people got on, and people started looking at me, and I smiled. Yes, I'm white, but I'm friendly, I'm here to help. And when I got off, an enormous black man, really, really tall, must have been 6'8". He said, "Excuse me, ma'am, do you know where you are?" I said, "Oh, I think so." I said, "I have an address," and he said, "Why don't you let me walk you there?" And I thought, oh God, what am I getting into? I walked down the steps and he said, "I think there's somebody waiting for you." And halfway down the block were the two young black men who ran the organization that I was going to see. And I said, "Yes, I think they're waiting for me." And when I got there, they said, "You're Maddie Lee." And I said, "How could you tell?" So it was real, this extraordinary ability to meet with people who were struggling against all of the ills that unfortunately are now coming back to haunt us again. And then internally, and I will stop, I promise. I won't stop, okay. I pioneered within the philanthropic world the radical idea of having grantees and trustees of foundations meet each other. It really hadn't happened before. And I took advantage of a virtually unlimited budget to take about 25 grantees each year up to the Heroin. How many of you have been there to the what is it called? The Heroin Estate. It's got a Columbia.
What are you talking about?
No, a Heroin.
The Heroin Estate up at the top of the mountain. Okay, you haven't been there. It's the former governor's mansion, and it is, robber baron heaven. It looks like some French chateau. And Columbia owned it at the time, so you could rent it for good purposes.
Columbia University, it's right in the middle of the park. I've been there.
Right. I think they've now sold it and it's owned by something not so worthy. But I treated these grantees from all over the 5 boroughs to these baronial dinners with the trustees. And we instituted a requirement that every trustee of the foundation had to visit a grantee at least once a year. And those were something else.
I have a question. How did you get the grantors, the trustees to agree?
I have very strong powers of persuasion.
I'll bet.
I think all you need to do is get 2 to say what a great idea it is, and then everybody else can't say, "Oh, I think it's terrible." And the other truly radical thing, I'm embarrassed to say, except at the time and now I say it should go on my tombstone. And that is that I pioneered the common application form. There are hundreds of foundations. There are less than hundreds, but a lot of foundations in New York. And until I did what I did, if you applied to any of them, you had to write a different proposal for each funding source, because they each had different questions, different numbers, and it was murder on these small groups trying to raise money. And so I pioneered the idea of a common application form, and it is now accepted in New York as what they do. And I saved enough money for people out there not to have to make a grant. Okay, that's my early life.
I feel like I should make a comment, so I thought, well, what am I gonna say? I'm gonna say, Maddie makes it sound easy. but anyone who's worked with such divergent populations knows how hard it is to get people to change their minds, or not change their minds, but still agree to do the thing. So let's just remember how difficult it can be. Moving on, taking all of these skills with Martin to Woodland Pond, with, as you said, a lot of language skills, and you also said something about poker.
Yes. After my husband, Martin Horowitz, who died 3 years ago, came, and we came here together. And as we moved around and met people, people would say, "Do you play bridge?" And I would say, "No." And they would look sort of crestfallen. And then they would say, "Do you play mahjong?" And I would say, "No." And I got tired of being asked that. So I said, "Why doesn't anybody say, do you play poker?" And so one person said, "Well, do you play poker?" And I said, "I do, and certainly do." And so we started one of the funniest poker games. Connie Hornbeck will remember these. Connie Hornbeck won every poker game she played. And I'm convinced that exactly, that's exactly what I'm convinced. She just went like this. I'm convinced Connie cheats, but she always won, and we couldn't catch her at it. They were hilarious games. We incurred the wrath of the bridge group because they used to go over their time, and we would horn him on that. And the other thing that stands out about the poker game is that the pot was never right. We were playing penny, nickel, dime poker, so the stakes were very high, as you can imagine, and it never came out right. We had different people count, we had two people count, we tried counting at the beginning and counting at the end, it never worked. And I think it was Connie. It wasn't enough that she was gonna win it, she was also stealing from the pot. Just don't trust that smile. What else did we do here? Okay, so when we came, Woodland Pond was a project of the Kingston Hospital?
Yes.
Kingston Hospital. And that meant we didn't have our own CEO. They sent somebody over every few months. And most of them were kind of nice guys, and you knew not to get too close to them because they wouldn't be there in another 3 months or so. And then it was decided that we were going to break off from the Kingston Hospital. And the reason we were originally under them was that they didn't feel that a CCRC had the strength to survive by themselves. It needed an established institution. And I don't know whether it was Michelle alone, but it was certainly the board decided, no, we're going to try on our own. There was talk about merging with another CCRC. Oddly enough, nobody was interested. And so we did. We announced that we were going to do that, and that required the production of bylaws. Now, I happen to know a little bit about bylaws because new nonprofits have to develop them, we would have to review them, we would have to go through it. So I volunteered, and I was on a very small committee. I think there were 4 people, I don't even remember who the other people were because I didn't know them. And we drafted bylaws for this new organization. And when we started talking about the board of directors, this goes right up there with a common application form. I want you to know, this is my claim to genius. I said, we want to have resident representation on the board. Oh, no, can't do that. And I said, why not? And nobody knew. They didn't know that they couldn't because it wasn't true. And they didn't know why not. And we got 2 resident board members, and at the time, I think we may have been the only nonprofit CCRC that had that. During the early years of the change, the Residence Council was a very different organization from what it is now. When I first went to a resident council meeting, I was told that residents were not allowed to be there. I said, what do you mean? And they said, we have closed meetings. So I went and I looked at the bylaws, and that wasn't true. And it says here, resident council meetings shall be open to all residents, and the then head said, well, we don't interpret it that way. So we opened it up. I got elected. Eventually I became president of the council. And we made a lot of important changes. First of all, we opened the meetings. Secondly, we instituted something called ears, which was a time when members of the resident council would be available to anybody. It wasn't at the meeting, it was that we took turns once a week, and we sat in the lounge over there, and we just waited. And people came, and if they came and they were talking to you and somebody else came by and heard it, they would say, oh yeah, well, I have something I want to talk about. So that's what we began to, that's how we began to find out how the community felt about things. The other, this goes up there again, I'm telling you, this is with the common application and my other genius. We decided that there were too many issues for the resident council to handle by itself, and we established subcommittees. And the first really important one was a separate committee for the health center, which until then had nothing. I mean, they were just considered part of the community, and none of us knew anything about the health center, none of the people on the council. Stein was the first chair of that. It was really important, and we were really very proud of ourselves. And I guess the last innovation was the office of a corresponding secretary, so that we could be sure we answered people who bothered to write us. I think that's probably it in terms of innovations from my past.
Well, I want to say I'm on the council now, and when you think about it, it really has all of these liberal, open, receptive pieces to it that were brought in. None of this was automatic. And sometimes it just feels like a pleasure to see how Little Pond works. We were just looking at all the groups and committees that we have, and the range of activities, the range of interest groups is so phenomenal. And I think part of it is the freedom that people feel to form groups, to form organizations within the organization. And as you say, ears is still going, and people show up. Anybody shows up with any topic, and we listen. And very often it's something really substantive that requires some thought and some activity. So this all comes from that, and my sense is most CRCCs do not have this kind of spirit.
That, I don't know, I mean, you all have friends at other CCRCs.
No, I don't.
I don't. You're a lucky woman. But certainly in the few times that I actually talk to people about their CCRCs, I think Woodland Pond really is quite unusual in the amount of interplay that there is between management and residents, and the amount of actual power that residents have, although we don't use that word. Talking about power is a difficult conversation in America these days. And it's particularly difficult in a place like this where people, I think many people operate under fear of the administration, whether they admit it or not. And I know that's why Michelle is constantly saying, you can talk to me, you can come into my office, you can make an appointment, you can call me, you can email me, it's okay. Because I think people feel vulnerable when they come here, and they don't always get over that.
You had said to me that a particular interest of yours these days is about the other.
Yeah.
Take it away.
Okay, this arose from more than one conversation that I've had with people here who say somebody new is, you know, really nice, but she's a Trumper, and I don't want to have dinner with her.
Yeah.
And each time, I'm afraid, I respond with this granny kind of lecture about that's exactly what the problem is in the country at large. Nobody talks across that gulf anymore. Well, what am I going to say? They're just going to say this, and then I'm going to tell them they're wrong or whatever. I said, no, the secret is to listen, not to talk. But unless we practice doing that, unless we practice sitting down and breaking bread with people who do not agree with us, we are simply doing what the entire country is doing, which is casting people into roles when we really know very little about what they think. Listening, not arguing, finding a way to hear what the other person is saying. And if we can't do that here, then where could it happen? We share, most of the experiences that we have are shared by other people. We encounter other people all the time. I have a book to recommend called Strangers in Their Own Land, a fantastic book written by Arlie Hawkshaw, who was a graduate student and moved to, I think it was Louisiana, and was introduced to a lot of red families, and she just listened. And she began to understand where they were coming from. She began to understand how arrogant people on the left sound, how patronizing they sound, how privileged they are without realizing it. And the book sets you back on your heels. So that's a recommendation and a plea to find a way to talk across that gulf. You don't have to try to convince them. Whether you are a pro-Trumper or an anti-Trumper, you don't have to convince them, but it helps to know why they're talking about what they're talking about. They're not yahoos and rubes and stupid and all of those ugly words that people use. So that's what you were asking about.
Yes. Do you want to say anything more about that?
I don't know, did I use
Well,
something else?
no, but the words power and other lead me to my next topic. As I said, Maddie says her heritage is really two ships, and I call it from the shtetl to the Mayflower.
No, it's the Mayflower to the shtetl.
From the Mayflower to the shtetl. I bet you can guess which is which. Maddie's a range of backgrounds. Maddie's father is Leo Rosten, who wrote the book The Joys of Yiddish and The Education of Hyman Kaplan, which were both major books back then, major books. And she can tell us about his background, and he was also a Hollywood screenwriter. And as Maddie said to me, oh, I grew up in Beverly Hills. Okay. Her mother's brother is William Stein.
No, brother-in-law.
Oh, brother-in-law.
Brother-in-law. Married my mother's older sister.
Her brother-in-law, I wondered why he had a different name. What is his name? Stein. Anyway, William Stein is one of the great New Yorker cartoonists. He must have worked for them for 30 years. Okay.
His people lived in tenement housing, and the women were always wearing house dresses, and out in the back window was laundry strung across, and you could see the other tenement windows.
Wait, and her mother was the sister of Margaret Mead. So Maddie really grew up with Aunt Margaret? Okay. Start anywhere. And the Mead family came over on the boat after the Mayflower?
The first one, I don't even remember when.
Yeah.
There are Meads and Foggs, F-O-G-G, in the oldest graveyards in Deerfield, in Amherst, and some other rock-ridden town. So that's my mother's side of the family. And my father came over steerage class. He was not born in this country. He was born in Poland, not in a shtetl, as I kept trying to tell
The
you.
big city of Lodz.
Right, which is pronounced Łódź.
Lodz.
And so I had an immigrant father and a daughter of the American Revolution mother. And what can I say? It was a very intellectual family. We had very grown-up conversations at the dinner table. My parents would argue passionately. I'm convinced that at some point in their young lives, my parents were communists, but they denied it, and it was not a good time to have been a communist. We had friends who were blackballed. We had friends who were interrogated by Joe McCarthy's HUAC, House Un-American Activities Committee. And I was taken to Episcopal Church every Sunday. My Episcopalian mother took me to a low church, Episcopalian church, and my Jewish father waved goodbye to us. Because of my second husband, Martin Horowitz, whom I moved with here, I converted to Judaism with a very real sense of coming home, that this really was where I belonged. And I did that during a period. Martin got a job with, well, it doesn't matter who the sponsor was, but the job was making small grants throughout the former Soviet Union and Ukraine to emerging Jewish communities there. This was at a time when the established Jewish community in America was saying we had to get them out. We had to get the Jews out. The ground was burning under their feet. They would not be safe. And Martin didn't believe that, and a lot of Russian Jews didn't believe it either. So he also began leading donors, mostly, sort of expeditions of donors, and they met wonderful people because I went with them several times. They took them into people's homes, and the women taught them how to make gefilte fish from nothing, and they met young children who were finally being taught Judaism. And yet the American, inevitably, somebody would say, "Why are you staying here?" Until one woman said, "We're not staying here, we live here." And it stopped that terribly patronizing notion about how could you want to live here to people who had lived there all their lives. I mean, the grandchildren had lived there, their great-grandchildren, the grandparents, they were Jews. That's why they were staying, they were Russian Jews. He was fluent in 5 languages, one of them being Old Church Slavonic. How, you asked, did I find that out? We were traveling in Czechoslovakia. We were having coffee and pastry, and he picked up the local paper. And I said, "I didn't know you could read that." And he says, "Well, it's very similar to Old Church Slavonic." I'm not, well. What more do you want to hear about it?
The other languages.
Okay, he would say that he wasn't really fluent in German, but he could certainly read it and made a pretty good shot at speaking it. Hebrew, English, Yiddish, Russian, and Spanish. Oh, he was so proud of his Spanish because he had learned it starting in 6th grade with Senor Campos at a junior high in California, out in the valley. And on one memorable day, my 2 sons by my first marriage, and Martin and I, met in Spain around Christmas time. And my older son, Josh, came from New York, where he was studying at Columbia. My younger son, Ben, came from Rome, where he was studying, I don't know, ancient Greek, I think. And Martin came from Russian. But Martin was the only person who spoke Spanish, and he spoke it very proudly with everyone at the hotel. And I finally stopped the Metro D, and I said, "Tell me, how is Senor Horowitz's Spanish?" And he said, "Is Spanish, madame? His accent is wonderful. His Spanish is terrible."
I gather Martin was also influential at Woodland Pond. He started the Yiddish group.
Did not start the Yiddish group, that is
But I think
false,
he at
that is a rumor.
I think at some point he controlled the Yiddish group.
That's possible.
I was not there.
That's entirely possible. Martin came to the Yiddish group long before we came to Woodland Pond. We had a weekend one-room schoolhouse in Gardner. It's the Libertyville Schoolhouse, which you go past if you go out that way. And he read about it in the local paper, so he would go to the Yiddish group, and that's fine, I don't speak Yiddish. When we did begin looking for CCRCs, and Woodland Pine came up, they had moved from where they were meeting, which was in the second floor coffee shop. In
Bakery.
Well, the bakery was after that. First, it was the one on Water Street. Anyway, they met in town, but then they moved here because one of their members became a resident. And I saw it on our list of possible places, and I said, "Oh, Martin, look, I mean, what's it like? What's Woodland Pond like?" He said, "I don't know." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I just go to Yiddish there. I don't know anything about it." And that was very typical of Martin.
Okay, what else should I ask you? Well, you did tell me you met Groucho Marx. And you made allusion to a childhood in Beverly Hills, which really is quite unusual.
No, they have children in Beverly Hills too.
Yes, but most children don't grow up in Beverly Hills.
Well, that's true.
With theater.
Groucho Marx was a friend of my father's.
But your father was also a screenwriter.
Yes.
He didn't just live there.
No, it's typical of my father. He was writing screenplays, and the movies are still on television if you're interested. There was one called All Through the Night. There's one called Sleep My Love. They're black and white. They're wonderful. I mean, they're, star of stage and screen kind of glamour. But he was also working for the Rand Corporation. And like the State Council on CCRCs, it was completely confidential. And I was never to know what he did. But he also worked for the Office of War Information during the war, and he couldn't talk about his work there except for a fascinating story. During the war, everybody involved on both sides read everything that the protagonists did, including the funnies. And Dick Tracy began to talk about a mega bomb, and the Office of War Information needed to decide what to do about it. Should they censor it, or should they allow it to happen? And what they decided was they had to let it happen, because otherwise it would look as if they were in fact squashing something. So out it came, and I was, even as a kid, pretty interested in that. And the other great thing, I never quote my father, as many people here will know, but I do quote him about this. When I was about, I don't know, probably 15 and a passionate adolescent, and the generation running the country was ruining it, and we were the only ones who really understood, and kids were going to take over the world, and the world was in a terrible position, and it was all their fault. My father, who was reading the paper at the time, took his glasses and, Maddie, we didn't know we were going to win World War II. And I gotta tell you, it absolutely changed my way of looking at the world. It chastened me. We then went on to disagree about just about everything else. I told him he was to the right of Genghis Khan. He said that my expensive education had all been for nothing. That kind of conversation.
Is there anything that I've left out? Would you?
That's a hard question to
Would
answer.
you want to tell us one or two tiny Margaret Mead stories? Aunt Margaret? Or New Yorker stories?
I never really knew William Stein. His daughter and son were very close cousins, but he and my aunt Liza had divorced by then. Bill Stein, by the way, in case you still haven't remembered what he looks like, his cartoons look like, also in his later life wrote a series of wonderful children's books called Roland the Minstrel Pig. What's the other really great one? And Shrek. He was the creator of Shrek.
He did Shrek?
Yeah.
Wow.
Margaret Mead, well, It was quite something to have Thanksgiving dinner at my house because everybody drank. There was a lot of drinking in the WASP side of the family. The Jews didn't drink that much. Did you hear that? The Jews did not drink very much, but the WASPs definitely chugged it down. So tempers ran high and opinions ran high, and these were all very, very literate, deeply grounded people who could hold their own in almost any debate. And I remember Margaret and a visiting brain surgeon disagreeing about, I think it was about adolescent sexuality, because that was the thing she was most famous for. It was a book called Coming of Age in Samoa. And she was known throughout the world, and we always knew this. I mean, I knew she was one of the most famous women in the world, and she was just my Aunt Margaret as far as I was concerned. She gave great presents. She would bring things back from wild and woolly places that were just gorgeous.
Thanksgiving.
Yeah, I know, but it wasn't at Thanksgiving that this happened. I'd gotten off the track and I've forgotten what I was going to say. She was reminiscing about something. I was home from, must have been college, and she was reminding me of something that had happened between the two of us. And she said, "It was about that time that you developed the most appalling Jewish shrug." That's what it is. That's the appalling Jewish shrug. She's an anthropologist. I guess she thought it was okay. She was quite a devout Episcopalian, just in case you didn't know that about her. But very serious and very high church. And at her funeral, a wonderful Episcopal priest who became a friend of all of ours said of the hymn that she had chosen, "Trust her to choose a hymn nobody can sing." And I don't remember what it was, but it was certainly this very large congregation was sort of creaking and croaking their way through it, and thank God there was a very loud organ.
Maddie, thank you very much. I think this was more than we bargained for. Questions?
Maddie, what did you teach at the Dalton School?
English.
What did I teach?
English?
English. Yeah.
You're good at it.
I made them memorize the prepositions, all of the prepositions in English. It's great to give a challenge to young adolescents. They really like it. They lined up for that. So out about, they were fantastic.
How many prepositions are there?
50 something.
How many?
50 something.
50 something.
I guess we weren't taught.
At, about, around, before, behind. I mean, once you get started,
Alphabetical order.
well, they didn't have to do it in alphabetical order, but it was much harder for me to tell whether they'd done it if they hadn't done it in alphabetical order.
So Maddie, what are you going to be doing next?
Repeat the question for the.
Frida says, Maddie, what are you going to be doing next?
Well, I do teach a short story group. We meet every 2 weeks. This thing at the state level is supposed to meet, so I get myself all worked up and read the papers that they send me, which are like this again, really boring, excruciatingly boring. And then they cancel the meeting. And they can't keep doing that forever, so I will probably be going up to Albany. And I'm happy not to be doing much else.
Maddie, did you get a chance to compare Woodland to others?
Yes.
How do we rate? I mean, I know you're
Repeat the
gonna be a
question.
little,
Connie is asking if Maddie had a chance to compare Woodland Pond to other CCRCs, and where did we rate?
We looked at several Kendalls because I was particularly interested in Kendalls. The idea of the CCRC was actually created by the Quakers. I don't know what the name of their central governing thing is, but they began wondering what existed for older people who needed some help but not a lot. And the very first one was outside Philadelphia, I think, and it was a Kendall. And I will tell you that the marketing for Kendall's is better than ours. Because the first thing they hand you is a statement of principles. And I just remember being bowled over by that. Just incredible. This is what we believe. This is how we try to behave. This is how we try to structure our organizations. Physically, I think Woodland Pond is the most beautiful of the places that we visited. We went to the Kendall on Hudson, and I was not happy the minute I walked in. The rooms were kind of shrunken. It's as if each apartment was just downsized slightly. And the first thing the marketing woman there said was something along the lines of, you better make up your mind today because they're selling like hotcakes. And I was not impressed with that one. I think the management of Woodland Pond is unparalleled, absolutely unparalleled. The commitment to transparency, the amount of communication, the different ways of communication are incredible. Oh, I know another thing I did when I came here. I'm the person who said we had to talk about death at the marketing lunch. You can imagine how effective that was. They have a panel with the dining room filled with prospective people, all of them trying hard to look as if they're really not interested in this because they're too young, they're just sort of thinking about it. So everybody is essentially acting as if they don't really think they need this. But it's an effective thing. We go and we sit at a table in front of them, and during all of the changes of courses, we walk around and talk to people at the tables and so on. And when we had an evaluation, I said, look, I think it's great that we talk about all the music and all the cultural things and how great the staff is and how wonderful the grounds are and how much freedom we have. But I do think it's wrong to act as if people are just moving into a country club. I mean, I think we have to talk about death. And I think essentially what they said was, all right, you do it. And so I did. I talked about Martin's death here. Martin died about 3 years ago. And given that it was a horrible thing, and he died of Lewy body dementia after about what we now realize was 5 or 6 years of decline. I just nagged him and thought he wasn't trying hard enough until we found out that it was Lewy body dementia. And the experience was incredible. He was in skilled nursing for about 3 months, I think. And when Martin died, I was surrounded by 3 women friends, none of whom I had known before I came here. One of whom is here now. Dawn. Were you the one who had to sing You Are My Sunshine? Not the best choice. Well, we didn't realize it. We didn't realize it until we got well into it and we couldn't exactly stop. So I talked about the fact that you make a kind of friends here that you don't make on the outside. You can't count on the friends you've had forever to still be there. And it's effective. People like it.
Yaakov was.
Well, that's good to have such a nice friend.
We're not finishing yet. I have something to say.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, when we came here, it was the first CCRC we saw ever. No, exactly, I'm sorry. It's the second one because we had our neighbor friends that moved to the one on the Hudson, on the other side of the Hudson, the Kendall on the Hudson.
No, Kendall. Oh, that one downtown.
No, it's on.
On the Hudson?
Not the fountains at Millbrook.
No, it's on the other side of the Hudson River, south, going south.
Near the bridge.
Huh?
Near the bridge, near the George
Yeah.
Washington. Yeah, no, that's the one we went to.
Yeah, and we saw it was like a very nice kind of vacation place when we saw it because our neighbors moved there. He turned 100 about a year ago. And we were very good friends for 25 years. I mean, we just lived across the street. And we came here just accidentally, really. I mean, the first time we saw the place, it looked nice, you know, and so on. Then we were invited to a luncheon. And we came with kind of mixed feelings. And as a matter of fact, we brought my daughter that lives not far from here, and the social worker, which is a very good friend. And they told us after the fact that they came with negative attitude to see what's going on. But halfway through the presentation, you, and I think it was Don and Paul and a few others, which I have no idea who they were, convinced us, and I think it was John also, because I remember
Yeah, John was there.
just left.
Just left.
That I asked him about what do we do with all my tools, and he says, we don't need it, I mean, you have all the tools. So, in retrospect, I think it was the thing that convinced us that this is a different type of place. And it was most effective, at least for us, because we saw that the environment is we felt the friendship and the transparency, not just from management, because it was not the sales pitch by management, it was by the people living here. And we must say that, I mean, we are absolutely positively surprised, because we say, well, you know, maybe it's not exactly like that. Now, I have another technical question. You say that you were involved in writing the bylaws of the council or of the bylaws of the board, or both?
The bylaws of the corporation.
Of the corporation, also of the bylaws of the council?
Yes, and the, what was that other thing, they're now calling it something else, the residence handbook. That was part of it.
Not the residence handbook, there is also a bylaws of the residence council.
Both
The
sets of
residence
bylaws.
council, I think I was involved.
The reason I'm asking it is because we just finished a meeting, well, we finished a series of meetings at the council, and we came across a question. There is a definition there of combined board. Yeah, I'm just, I would like to hear if you have anything, a reason why that was there, combined committees.
She was
Oh,
more
my.
involved in.
Never mind.
Which issue?
It's
probably involved in
a
several
technical
things.
issue about the committees here. There are different groups. There's,
Standing committees, which were then
there's
changed
interest
to council
groups. Anyway,
committees.
so maybe you could discuss it with Maddie separately, but I do want to say one thing. Connie asked, what are you going to do next? Or Frida asked, what are you going to do next? I'll tell you. We have a mental health committee that's starting to develop different programs. And at one of our meetings, I said something about maybe having a presentation on the health center because people get afraid of it. And everybody said, oh yes, that's the elephant in the room. About 20 minutes later, we continued talking, and I said, what about presentations on death and dying? And they said, oh, now that's the elephant in the room. So I think you can expect to have your brain picked in the next 2 weeks.
No, I think it's fascinating how little we talk about death here.
Yes.
It's really, really interesting. It is on our minds. We may try very hard to push it away. We may even succeed, but there was something there that needed to be pushed. And it isn't just death, it's dying. E.E. Cummings said, I'm not afraid of dying, but death, oh baby, I would not like death if death were good. Now that's E.E. Cummings trying to deal with it. I think you're right. I think you're right, but I think there's great hesitance. And my guess is it's less among residents than it is among staff to institute that kind of conversation.
Well, there have been death cafes and other things, right?
We did have a death cafe.
There've been, I mean, I talked to Sarah about this maybe 6 months ago. To why aren't there programs, because I have led a number of preparation for death and dying workshops through my Rotary Club and my Quaker meeting. And and she said, oh, we've had death cafes and we're gonna have another, and they did. But that's sort of an occasional
Right,
thing,
right.
as opposed to an ongoing conversation.
Right.
Right.
That's right.
So,
I think one more question before we finish, Bernice?
Well, I was just gonna share a Louis.
Use the microphone.
Yeah.
I was just gonna share a little conversation with, we've been here since 2009. And so this was one of the early CEOs. And I had asked some sort of question, I don't even remember what my question was. But he said, oh, you don't have to trouble your head about that. And I was so offended because that's so patronizing. And we don't experience that. And I say it's all the residents who are questioning people, and fortunately here, nobody's afraid to ask a question. So that's my,
I think you're right.
comment.
Where was that? Here. Did you have that patronizing response?
Gretchen just looked out her door and went.
Oh, the email has gone out. It went too far.
3 o'clock.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Maddie.
He was kind of early.
Well, I have to have my CEO.
Oh, I can imagine.
Didn't last very long.
Last time I came out,